working with clients who may present with dementia. Can we work with people with dementia? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, let me preface this by an experience I had when visiting a tea room last year. I was sat having tea and a cake with my wife, and I was aware that someone sat opposite me. It was a woman. She'd be maybe in her 60s, and she just started talking to me without any filter. And it became clear to me that what she was talking about in her life was out of sync. It became very clear very quickly that this person may have had some cognitive difficulty or maybe some dementia. Mm-hmm. But it was very urgent that she talked to me. So I listened to her, over my tea. I listened to her. And what was in the background, I could see the people who were kind of working in the tea room looking at me a bit puzzled. She was obviously a regular visitor. And they may have thought that she was maybe a bit distracting to the customers, but I listened to her, and quite clearly, as 10 minutes elapsed, it was clear to me that she had some difficulties, cognitive difficulties, which could be dementia related. But right at the end, when I spoke to her, and it was a jumble of information, the past, the future, really disconnected things. She just looked at me and she said, "Thank you for listening." And I said, "You're very welcome." And she went on her way, and I went on with my tea. And my wife mentioned something about, "Do you never stop?" But it just seemed very meaningful. And what was really interesting, and this, I'll come to the question, and it was asked by Greg James, who's doing a presentation on dementia. So hi, Greg. And he has a couple of questions. And one of the points he comes is can any meaningful work be done? And I'm of the view, after doing this for a long time, it depends what you mean by meaningful. Are we doing lots of change, or is somebody validated by being heard? And I think as a therapist, that is our first position, that they're heard in the world, that someone's listening to them. We don't always have to get clients, or clients don't always want to make huge changes in their life. Maybe what they want to do is just be heard and acknowledged and not discounted. They want to be accounted for. So that's the first point he's asking, can you do any meaningful work with people with dementia? Well, it would depend what the dementia is. And you have to be very thoughtful. The first thing I would say is that Rogers talked about 6 conditions. And the first one was psychological contact.
That came up for me, as you were saying.
Yeah. And that then leads us on to an ethical perspective, where can we say that the client has enough capacity to understand what's going on? I was just listening to someone in a tea room. I want to be very clear. I don't think I would have counselled this person, because I wouldn't have been convinced enough that the person would understand what I was doing and have the capacity. So he asked, do you work closely with doctors? I think that usually you wouldn't have a student who'd be past a client like this. It would be very, very unusual. And I'd be a bit concerned, quite frankly, because this is something from an experienced therapist who may have to work with doctors or even members of the family. So we're into triangulation contracts. We're into areas of confidentiality. But there are people who just have, cognitive errors where the rest of their life is fine. It's just some things that get out of sync. So to answer your question, I think it would be, can the person give you consent? Do they actually know what they're having? That's the first position. And the second is having to take an assessment, because if people start to deteriorate, at some point, you're going to have to make another ethical decision. Are they now the same person they were when you first started the therapy? And the same can happen with people with, brain cancers or any degenerative issue around the brain.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I guess that's something to look at if the person does come in and there is psychological contact. And if you're wondering what that is, it basically means that both parties understand why they're there, and that it is therapy and that they're working together for a common goal. That is psychological contact. And when that is diminished on either side, then the theory states that it is no longer therapy. And I guess if somebody came in and they were able to have that psychological contact, but it was a degenerative condition, it would be about contracting around that. But then would they then be able to understand the contract after the degeneration? It's really tricky, and it's certainly not an area that I personally would counsel in. I do not feel adequately equipped. As you said, Rory, you may not counsel that person. And I know that there is so much research, really massive, great work that is being done for these kind of conditions, these cognitive degeneration conditions. And I think you've got to have a real understanding of it. You've got to know what you're doing. You've got to know the science behind it. It's more than just being there with someone that has distress. And the story you told, Rory, of the tea shop, a lovely, lovely story. And I think sometimes there's a difference between therapy and therapeutic. So was it therapy that you offered there? No. But was it therapeutic for that person? Yes. And you know that. How is that evidenced? Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can be therapeutic without necessarily offering the therapy. But then again, therapy is about a contracted arrangement at a specific time, at a specific place, for a specific goal outcome. It's a really tricky question.
Yeah, and always, and I don't know if you remember this, Ken, I'm so grateful to one of our students many years ago when Ken and myself taught. One of the pleasures we had was watching our students present their research to their peers and to us. And I always loved that because I always learned something new.
Yeah.
I used to put it down as CPD because they'd researched it. It was good. And I remember one person, I will call her Susie. If you're listening, she may not be listening, but if you're, hi to you. And she did some research on validation therapy. It was developed by an Ohio resident who studied at Columbia University. And it was called validation therapy. And what was really, really interesting is that it uses the basis of Carl Rogers' core conditions, but delivers it in a slightly more nuanced way. And validation therapy is about when someone talks about something that may be very disconnected, you work with their frame of reference with it. And to allow them at least to process that part of what they're experiencing. And I think that is very, very useful. We're going to put the details in the show notes. It's called a validation, or it's sometimes called the FILE method, and it was developed in 1982. And really interestingly, it's something that's taught to carers, to professionals in the world of Alzheimer's and cognitive degeneration. But the final point I want to come to, Greg, let's come down here, is that sometimes just being heard's enough. We can get so caught up in this, clients need to make changes and ticking GAD forms and all this type of thing. Actually, sometimes just being acknowledged, counted for in the world, just being heard is enough.